Hey everybody, Raul here for Bass Musician Magazine, and today we have the extraordinary honor of pleasure of chatting with bassist, producer, vocalist, arranger, songwriter for over 55 years, Jerome Rimson. Yay!
Thank you very much. How are you?
Outstanding, Jerome. As always, with such exciting of a curriculum vitae as you have, we like to go all the way to the past. How did you get started in music and particularly on bass?
Well, music, my grandfather was a Pentecostal bishop of a third of the United States, right? So I was kind of singing on shoeboxes and stuff from the age of about 5 years old in the church, you know, and it actually on both sides of the family, because my mother's father turned out to be a bishop as well. I come from a very Pentecostal religion background, although I was a villain, but yeah, the family line on both sides deeply steeped in religion. So basically, like I said, I started out probably kind of trying to push the pedals on a Hammond B3. Hammond organs are still my favorite thing. I still own 2 of them that are in my house in Atlanta, Georgia.
Nice.
But yeah, so that was where I started out, and then the way I got to bass, when we were in high school, I had a great friend named Lester Williams, and he's still around. He's still playing in Detroit, keyboard player. But the thing was, he actually had a Hammond organ, and I had a kind of like imitation Vox organ. So he kind of won out on that one. And the only thing they didn't have in the band was a bass player. So I thought, okay, I'll have a look at this bass thing. And then I had a great friend named Tom Gracie, who was a Polish guy. Detroit was a funny place. Detroit was basically very, very, very Irish, very Polish, very Italian, and obviously very black. So a lot of my friends when I was growing up, my best friend when I was growing up was a guy named John Murphy, which is so funny because I ended up living in Ireland. And my other friend was Tom Gracie, who actually played with the Detroit Emeralds. He was a guitarist, and he was actually from a Polish background. And like I said, my friend Les Williams, who was a keyboard player, he was a black guy from Detroit. Nice. So I ended up kind of picking up bass from that angle. And then what really convinced me about it, because the great thing about living in Detroit is all of the Motown people were accessible. You could go see them all the time. So there was this place called the 20 Grand, still there, I think. And it was kind of the main kind of place. It literally had 4 rooms. So they had the Driftwood Lounge, which was literally kind of a little private place that was off of a bowling alley, right? So they had the bowling and all that. Then they had the Fireside Room, which was like very cozy and all that. And actually, I got it wrong because the Driftwood was actually where they had shows. So the first time I saw really major acts like the Temptations and all that, they would all show up at the Driftwood Lounge, right? And then they had what they called the Gold Room, which was a huge room, and they would let us all go there. You had to be 17 and older. So once you were 17 years old, you could go to the Gold Room. And the Motown band or whoever was playing in the Driftwood Lounge were obligated to play for the teenagers on the Sundays in the Gold Room. So the first time I laid eyes on James Jamerson in person was at the Gold Room, and then I decided that I'm definitely going to play bass because the master was there,
Wow, that is very inspiring. And did you learn on your own? Did you pursue formal studies? How did you get to hone your craft?
Yeah, I kind of learned on my own. Like I said, because I was always a mixed person. I come from the deep hood, but I was always kind of used to call me the black hippie, right? Because I was always into while everybody else was listening to soul. Because obviously I was listening to soul. I was playing and I was in Detroit. But my favorite bands were bands like the Flock, the Leg. I was listening to Jethro Tull, stuff like that. And everybody in the hood thought I was crazy because none of them ever heard any of that stuff. As a matter of fact, in the hood, nobody actually listened to Hendrix until he did Band of Gypsies.
Wow!
Right? Because it was black guys in it. So they did. Although, in truth, one of my friends that became a friend of mine was actually Mitch Mitchell from Jimi Hendrix, right? So but I met him once I got to London. But I was playing all that kind of stuff back in Detroit when I was like 16, 17 years old, So I was kind of always into. I think because of Hendrix. Hendrix was like my number one hero, especially when I was younger. So like, I mean, if somebody said to me, "You have to name two people that really influenced you the most," I would have to say Jimi Hendrix and Miles Davis.
Wow.
Yeah. Like, I mean, it's kind of hard to beat those two.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Other fans would be one of the greatest bands in my life was Crosby, Stills and Nash, and also Joni Mitchell. So, because I was like I said, I was into the peace movement. I missed Woodstock by 1 year.
Oh.
Yeah. I was 1 year too young. I was 1 year from meeting Hendrix, and actually, I think if I had met Hendrix and actually had a chance, I would have jammed with him at least.
And that kind of matches your wide vision of music, kind of being open to so much different stuff, has kind of played out throughout your career as well. Because you've played with, you've played with some Detroit players, but you've been Van Morrison, Steve Winwood, Phil Lynott, Freddie Mercury, Brian. I mean, the list goes on, but they're not all. As a matter of fact, they're very kind of in a wide array of genres. So
yes, I was very lucky. I mean, I don't know how much people put faith into various kind of philosophies or what have you. But somewhere around 1967, 68, I met a guy when actually we were hanging out on the dodgy side of Detroit trying to get some weed. but I met this guy who was like, the guy that handled the weed. But he was a unique character because I couldn't tell, for one, I couldn't tell how old he was, and you couldn't quite nail his nationality. If you know what I mean. He was a brown skinned guy, but he was like a guru in a way, And it was really funny because I was sitting there with him, and he had this book. I can't quite remember the name of the book, but he had this book, and I asked him something about the book. And he looked at me and he said, "You are now on the path." And he said, like, you will be encountering other people that know this information. And I was dead about weed, Yeah. But it was like really funny because right after that, I was working with Detroit Emeralds at the time. And right after that, we did this tour and we went to New York to the Apollo Theater. And it was called the Battle of the Soul Trios, right? So it was like the OJs, the Moments, the Main Ingredient, the Detroit Emeralds, Shy-Lights, right? It was all of those kind of bands. And during that process, I met Carlos Alomar, who was playing guitar with the Main Ingredient, Cuba Gooding Sr. But we used to all get on the bus because the singers, we had all these buses. We did a national tour, so we were on these Greyhound buses. But the singers decided not to take the bus, so most of the time they were flying. So all the musicians were on these three buses, and like, we would form bands that we would prefer to be in than the bands we were in. So I became really good friends with a guy, we called him Chicago Lou, who was a saxophone player for the Shy-Lights. Then me and him got along really well with Carlos Alomar, who was playing with Main Ingredient. And me and Carlos really hit it off because Carlos was sitting on the bus and he was doing the Rasha beads. He was doing Namio Ringiko, right? And he said to me, and he had that book. He had that same book that this guy in Detroit had that told me I would be on the path. So when Carlos showed me this book, I went, wow. And he said, yeah, man, you're on the path and you'll keep meeting these people. I kind of like really ended up following that to a great degree. And then I did a tour of Europe. This is how all of the other stuff happened. Did this tour of Europe, 72, 73, with Detroit Emeralds. Detroit Emeralds had a hit in England called "Feel the Need in Me," and then they had one other hit. But while we were doing that, there was a black British band that supported us on this tour with the Detroit Emeralds, and I had made up my mind because once we got to Europe, I realized that in America we were just a band for the Detroit Emeralds. We weren't counted as Detroit Emeralds. Although now it's so funny, we'll get to that. But in Europe, they treated all the musicians as equal. They treated us equal to the singers. So me being the opportunist that I am, I thought, well, this is a good time to jump ship. because I didn't see at the time. I didn't see my life progressing much in Detroit. I saw myself as being the Detroit Emeralds bass player, which was good, you know. It was, but I had other music in my head. I had other ideas, like I said, because I was really into the rock stuff, right? So I thought, well, Hendrix went to England. So once I got to England and saw how the English treated us, or the British, I thought, I'm staying here.
Yeah.
Right? So I just didn't return to Detroit. The Emeralds were really mad at me about that. I just decided to stay in England. But when I stayed in England, the band that was supporting us, this band, the real thing from Liverpool, right? And when I decided to stay in London, their manager, a guy named Tony Hall, said, "Wow, why don't you produce these guys?" So I ended up producing them, and their record ended up being a bigger hit than the Detroit Emeralds, which was in England.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah, they did this record called "You to Me Are Everything," the sweetest song my heart to sing, oh baby. So I produced that, or co-produced that with Ken Gold, and another song called "Can't Get By Without You," which was another big hit for them. So that kind of established me in England. And then in London, there was a jazz club called Ronnie Scott's. It's famous, it's world famous. It's still going, actually, Ronnie Scott's.
Yeah.
Right? And upstairs in Ronnie Scott's, they used to have all the Jamaican club, right? So if you like jazz, you go downstairs in Ronnie Scott's, and if you like reggae, you go upstairs. It was run by the Jamaican guys. So that's how I kind of worked my way into meeting all of these various people. The other main nightclub at the time for stars was a place called the Speakeasy in London. And in the end, we found out, it ended up being owned by John Entwistle on the Quiet.
Okay.
Right? Another bass player. Funny enough. Right? Right? So we used to all kind of hang out in the Speakeasy, but everybody was in the Speakeasy. I met a guy named Bobby Tench. He was guitar player, co-guitar player, and singer with the Jeff Beck Band back in the day. And he was from Trinidad. So he was the first black guy I met. Him and Conrad Isidore, who was playing drums with Crosby, Stills, and Nash at that time, right? But Conrad Isidore's other brother was a drummer. He played with Robin Trower. And the younger brother played guitar, who was Gus Isidore, who ended up with Seal, and is still one of my main partners, and I still do a lot of work with. So, through that, I mean, I was standing around in the Speakeasy, and once somebody said, "Oh, why don't you get up and have a jam?" So I got up and had this jam, and the next thing I know, I was surrounded by a couple of people, and one of those people was Jeff Beck.
Wow.
Right? So Jeff Beck said, "Hey, man, I like the way you play." But the thing was, Beck he's still an odd character. Well, he's gone now. But he was a different kind of character. You would take it as arrogance, but then I found out later is really because he was a shy person. So he had a manager guy who would talk for him. So I'm standing there with Jeff Beck and his manager, and Jeff would say to his manager, "Ask him this." And me being a Detroit guy and not aware of the protocol in Europe, I just kind of went, "Why don't you ask me yourself?"
You're right here.
Yeah. So So it was really weird because we kind of like did that. But then another good friend of mine, Phil Chin, bass player, that ended up playing with Rod Stewart on "If You Think I'm Sexy." He ended up doing the blow-by-blow thing with Jeff Beck because I was fairly, like I said, I was a Detroit guy, so I wasn't kind of refined enough to the British kind of protocol. So to me, I was just like a Detroit guy. I was going, well, like, hey, why I want to play with a guy? I'm standing here and he won't talk to me, So the funny thing about that is, like, years later, I joined this band, Automatic Man, with Michael Shreve from Santana, drummer, that did Woodstock, right? So we get this big gig in Oakland, California, the Oakland Coliseum, right? And we were supporting Jeff Beck, Jan Hammer, right? Which is funny because I hadn't seen Beck since, we didn't decide to do Blow by Blow.
Yeah.
Right? So Jeff had this whole thing, even at the big auditorium. When I'm walking around, I don't want to see anybody while I'm walking around. I'm on my way to the stage, So I purposely stood out there. So he came out and he's going, "I want to hear," but then he went, "It's you. What are you doing here?" And I was going, "Yeah, I'm doing Automatic Man." And he went, "Wow," and that was one of the best gigs I ever saw because Automatic Man was an amazing band. an amazing band. I would say that Bassist, Todd Cochran is still, him and Pat Thrall would have to rate the top musicians I ever met in my life.
Wow.
You know, Jazz Coleman from Killing Joke would be another one. Unbelievable. Classically trained guys that like just went the other way, you know, credible musicians, you know. So, and through that, once you're in LA, I mean, I ended up hanging out at Roxy. I ended up hanging out at the Viper Room and all that with Johnny Depp. Well, this was before Johnny became big, because I'm a lot older than Johnny Depp.
Yeah.
Well, not a lot, but a bit, you know. So, yeah, so it all kind of came together that way. Europe was another, because I kind of got drafted into this blues band with a guy named Joe Jammer out of Chicago. And we all decided we were just going to go to Montreux Jazz just to hang out. But once you got to Montreux, I was walking around. I was 23 years old when all of this happened, right? So I'm walking around Montreux with my bass on, and I'm just trying to get free stuff because they give away, all of the companies there. It's like Mama,
Yeah.
like all the endorsement deals and all that, right? So I see this guy who's like, middle-aged guy, and he's walking around, but he got all of these passes around his neck and stuff. So I just walk up to him like in my Detroit way, and I just go, "Hey, man, where do you get the free shit around here?"
Yeah.
And this guy is looking at me like, and he goes, "Can you actually play the bass?" I said, "Yeah, I can play the bass." He said, "Can you really play the bass?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, my name is Claude Knobs. I'm head of Warner Brothers International, and I run the Montreux Jazz Festival." And I'm like, "Whoa." Right? So this guy said, he gave me a pass, and he said, "You got to hang around this room." He said, "A lot of stars come in here, and they don't bring musicians with them. They're always looking for musicians, right?"
Mm-hmm.
So I got this pass to go in this room. So in this room, they showing all the videos and, before video movies of stars, right? So I'm just sitting in there, because you kind of hang around there. And I'm hanging around and I'm watching a movie, video, so to speak, about Fats Domino, right? And Fats is like in there kicking. And all of a sudden the door opens and in walks this guy with long hair. And he's kind of got on like a really kind of trendy, kind of dressed incredibly, and he had this woman with him who was stunningly beautiful and had on this kind of fox coat, right? And he sit down next to me and he's going, "Oh, wow, man, you watching Fats Domino?" And I'm going, "Yeah," and like, we watching the thing. And then this door opens and this long-haired, red-headed, looked like one of the Doobie Brother guys. He walks in and he goes, "Van Morrison needs a bass player." So this guy goes, "I play bass." And I go, "I play bass." And and then the guy says to me, "Oh, by the way, I'm Bill Wyman from the Rolling Stones."
Oh.
So I'm sitting there, and you can hear Van Morrison fucking going in the hallway. He goes, "Give me the black guy from Detroit." And that's how I met Van Morrison.
Nice.
Competing with Bill Wyman. Fucking funny. Me and Bill Wyman became really quite tight. He's a lovely guy, actually. But like, Montreux is a funny place because by knowing Claude Knobs, the head of the place, I did Van, and then I went back to London because I was living in London at the time. And then I got another call from Switzerland saying, "Look, this guy is coming to do what Ronnie Scott, and he doesn't have a band. He got a keyboard player with him, but he needs a drummer and a bass player. Do you want to do it?" And that turned out to be Al Jarreau.
Oh, wow.
Right. So I met Al Jarreau by accident in Ronnie Scott's club in London. And then I ended up going back to Montreux with Al a few times. Jarreau would be one of the greatest men that I ever met in my life as well. Such an incredible person, lovely person. He was a Tai Chi master as well. He was a very spiritual guy. Now, amazing. And so I watched him from the beginning. I watched Al Jarreau do stuff when nobody knew who he was, playing small clubs in Hamburg, but he was like a Pied Piper. I literally saw him in Saarbrücken in Germany. I watched a crowd of very, very, very sophisticated, almost black tie Germans end up on the floor with their arms locked, crying because Al Jarreau was singing. He was that powerful. He was like a Pied Piper.
Wow.
His first album, when he did this track called "Lock All the Gates," and people just end up crying in the aisles. He was heralded like unbelievable, And if somebody said to me, if you had one person to play with out of your whole life and tour with, it would be Jarreau again, because his clientele were just so sophisticated. They're all very knowledgeable. And then it was jazz, because like jazz is an interesting thing. because the highbrows come because, most jazz musicians are classically trained. They just, they learn how to flatten the fifth. You know what I mean? So they make blue notes in there, But so the crowd is always good. It's very, very, very rarely any kind of violence or that kind of stuff around the jazz scene. Whereas the most fun was rock and roll, obviously. I mean, when I was hanging out with Phil Lynott from Thin Lizzy, I mean, Jesus, like this guy, he was the epitome of a rock star, and when you come from a place like Ireland, he was the biggest rock star in Ireland because Ireland's not that big. So basically, it was him, Van Morrison. Van Morrison wasn't really considered Irish because he comes from Northern Ireland. So the Southern Irish consider him English.
Oh.
They don't really, because he's Protestant. Like, we live in Southern Ireland, the Catholics. All of that's been resolved a bit now. But back in the day, like, I mean, just crossing the border, I remember. I'll give you a quick story. I was doing Phil Lynott. We was touring around with Phil Lynnott's solo band, which included Darren Wharton from Thin Lizzy, myself, at times Brian Downey, the drummer from Thin Lizzy, but another for a lot of it, a guy named Mark Nassif from the States. And Gus Isidore, Jimmy Bain from Dio and Iron Maiden for some time. John Sykes, who ended up with Whitesnake and all that. We was all kind of hanging out, like So this was like Phil Lynnott's best friends on tour as a tax write-off around Europe, right? So I'm writing the book anyway. I won't stay on this too much longer, but just giving an example of what it was like being with Lynott. We came into town. We decided to drive it, so we're driving two big Mercedes 450 SELs. This is like 72, 73. So like very flash indeed. And we ride into Germany. And when we got to the hotel, there was 600 women outside the hotel just waiting on Phil Lynott. And this wasn't even for Thin Lizzy, just Phil Lynott, his charisma, right? And man, I can't tell you all the stuff on this interview, but I will send you a copy of the book.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, some incredible instances going on with him. The last 5 gigs, I'll give you an example. The last 5 gigs of the Phil Lynott European tour, Stockholm, Copenhagen, Amsterdam, Paris, and Rome, back to back. And every one of those cities, Thin Lizzy is huge. I mean, Stockholm, man, like I said, you get Stockholm and Copenhagen and stuff, and it's like 500-600 beautiful blonde girls, from Norway and all that, just hanging around.
Wow.
So that was without question the most fun. It was also my downfall because that was when I went through my cocaine phase and basically ruined everything and rebuilt like most people. But yeah, I went through that phase as well,
Gotcha. Well, and I'm glad you mentioned Montreux because if I understand correctly, you've got a project currently that you're working on that is related to Montreux. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, because of the two of my favorite artists, and I actually met through the Montreux connection, right? So Claude Knobs, again, he was the hero. He was the head of Montreux. Mm-hmm. He's gone now. But I wrote a piece of music dedicated to him, and the owl is gone now as well, right? Jerome, right? So I wrote this thing. Man, I seen Van Morrison. I was hanging out with Van Morrison literally a month ago. Me and him had dinner a couple of times in Cork and then in Dublin as well. Because we were thinking about maybe reuniting, but we had a good time talking about the 50 years we knew each other, right? But yeah, So the Montreux connection. I wrote this piece of music called "Ode to Montreux," and I dedicated it to Van Morrison, Claude Knobs, and Al Jarreau. It's getting ready to come out on my album probably in about 3 weeks.
And with that too, I can't, as we've been talking, I can't help noticing you got your bass next to you. I always like to know a little bit about gear. What's your main rig that you use to get your particular sound?
Well, more or less for my entire career. I mean, I switched a few times, but if you watch any major concert, look at any major festival, any big gig indoors or outside, if you look at the bass gear that they have supplied, it's always Ampeg. Always Ampeg SVTs, the big stuff, because it's the most reliable. You can get any kind of sound out of it. And I've switched out of Ampeg a few times because I had endorsements and I used a few other things. But my stay up until this time, I like the EBS gear as well, right? bass amplification. The reason they use Ampeg is because it's almost bulletproof. You have to do a lot to break an Ampeg amp, right? Also, they sound really good. So I literally had almost every Ampeg they ever made, from the little B15 they started out with. Then when they moved from that to the B18, and then they had one that had two 15-inch speakers in it, was their first solid state, all the way through. And at the moment, I'm still using Ampeg. I'm using a 1200 watt Ampeg Pro 4.
Wow.
Right? Yeah, and I use two 4x10 Ampeg cabinets. That's my main rig at the moment, right?
Gotcha.
But yeah, but I mean, like I said, I ventured out. I actually, Warwick, I had a deal with Warwick for a while that I actually got through John Entwistle. So I was using Warwick Bassist for a while. Again, that was one of the things that I kind of messed up my endorsement with them, because I had a bad habit during those years. And I bassist they gave me, and they found out about it, so they won't give me any more bassist. I mean, I'm sure we are right now, because that was years back. I mean, I haven't indulged in that kind of stuff since the 80s, but, you know, yeah, so that happened. But yeah, bassist, this is actually a Fender Aerodyne, which is actually made in Japan, but I bought it because it has the binding. Like, it looks like a fall. And so I just like the look of it. But if you have a look at that bass, everything about it is like actually custom made. I'm wearing EMGs on here. I'm using all gold tuning, so I set it up myself. So yeah, I think that any bass player that's worth his salt has got to have a Fender in his arsenal. Mainly because they still record the best. There's something about the Fender Precision that goes on tape better than any other bass. It's incredible, because I actually prefer the jazz basses, right? But when you're recording, it's something about Fender Precision. You got to have the good ones, but you can't really beat them for recording, you know? Van Morrison, he'll instantly, you go on stage with Van Morrison, he'll just turn around and go get a Precision, you know? Actually, two of the best basses I ever bought, I bought because Van Morrison didn't like jazz basses. So, you know, fortunately, he was paying enough that I could just go out and go, okay, I'll be right back. And I went and bought a bass, you know. Like, you know, yeah. The instruments, the Warwicks were like incredible basses as well, right? But I find everything outside of Fender has such a specific sound. I mean, Warwicks are great if you want the Warwick sound, right? Fenders are versatile. You can almost get any sound out of Fender bass, especially a jazz bass, if you know how to use it and you know your way around. And you're always learning. I found out probably 2 months ago about the bass sound that Family Man Barrett was getting with Bob Marley, right? And it's a trick that you wouldn't actually believe it. And it's like, what he did is he turns up the bass on full on the actual bass, right? He cut out all the treble, but then he would back off like literally a fraction off of the volume knob, and you'd get this bass sound that's like Bob Marley's bass sound. And I mean, I've been trying to do that for years.
Wow.
You know, and it was literally just like backing up by a fraction. You know, incredible. You know. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, and as we look ahead, what projects do you have in the works? Well,
yeah, right now, funny enough, my website is just being completed right now, and it's called Lone Wolf Productions, and that will literally be up online probably in about 5 to 10 days. And I'm producing. I'm doing mainly production. It was funny for years and years and years. I didn't really bother writing songs. You know, I was always making money as a bass player. And then, like, you know, like I said, I had a little bit of success with the real thing as a producer. But then, like, in my later years, I realized that I would prefer to be a producer. I actually think that my natural calling is more as an arranger than a bassist. I think the reason that I have the scope of the people I played with was mainly because I wasn't really thinking about playing bass. I was thinking arranger. Right? So the reason I could fit into any kind of band is because I would look at the arrangements. I was always looking at things almost as a producer. I didn't know that at the time, right? But I would just look, and because I can't read music, I mean, I can read chord charts and stuff, but I don't actually read tablature, right? But I'm one of those people that was blessed. I think that Detroit had a special thing. It was something in the water in Detroit because bass players from Detroit always had this thing. It's incredible. And I'll talk about instruments. I just got through looking up this special bass that I had called Ampeg. I'll give you the number of it in a minute. I got to look on my iPad here. And the first guy I ever saw playing one of these Ampeg bass, because Ampeg actually made 2 bass guitars back in the day, right? Most people don't know about them, right? And because I was always a Flash Harry, and like I always leaned toward rock, the bass player with Funkadelic Parliament, the original one, Billy Nichols, right? And he was playing an Ampeg bass. And he was playing this one. It had lots of curves on it. It was like, it looked like a woman's body almost. Like, as a curve. So I was going, wow, what a great sound. But then when I went to the shop and looked for it, they had this space age looking bass, right? Which the one I bought. Yeah. It was just so outrageous looking, It was really funny because when I think back on it now, I must have looked like a total idiot because in the hood, you just didn't walk around with basses that looked like, they looked like they should have belonged to Bootsy before there was a Bootsy.
There you go.
Space age looking. So I have a laugh about that now. But it was an incredible bass. And so just for the habit, just because I knew I was being interviewed by you, I thought, wow, I've never seen anybody talk about them. You never see these basses. So I went online and I actually looked it up. And that bass, at the time I bought it, I think I paid probably about $450 for it back in the day.
Oh, wow.
And it's now $10,000. And I got rid of it. I can't believe it. For $10,000 minimum, everywhere you look. The only other guy that was kind of famous for using them was a guy that played with the E Street Band, funny enough, with Springsteen.
There we go.
Yeah, I never met him, though, but yeah. So, nice. Instruments,
I tell you. Well, and circling back, you mentioned your website. Also, are you fairly active on social media and stuff? Other places where people can find out about you?
Yeah, I'm using Facebook mainly, but my management company, like let me mention my management and the label. See, my business partner is a guy named Kenneth Van Kempen, and he's actually half Dutch, half Indonesian. He's based in Dublin, but he's also based in Jakarta and what's the other place? Mali, somewhere in Indonesia, right? And in Amsterdam as well, right? Because he comes from Rotterdam. So me and this guy, we kind of met. He had a band that he was managing at the time, and me and him happened to jump into the same taxi, in Dublin. We just like, oh, taxi, and he jumped in one side and I jumped in the other. And I went, which way you going? He said, I'm going here. I said, well, funny, we kind of going in the same direction. And then we found out he had this band and that he was managing. He was a manager. He was managing another band called Blurf, which is like kind of the biggest band in Holland. Wow. Consistency. They'd be like the Dutch Doobie Brothers or something, Very incredible musicians. Then he ended up also working with Tony Levin, and he got another project that they even working on now called Zenland. And Tony Levin is like one of my favorite bass players of all time. He's unbelievable. And it's funny because I never met him yet. 2 of the guys that I really wanted to meet that I kind of communicate with through the wire, but never actually met in person. And I feel like they're friends. Pino Palladino, another one. Pino, man, this guy, he just got that feel. I always loved him. He was the first guy that impressed me with fretless, right? It's so beautiful. The way he plays is so beautiful. And we tease each other because we have a mutual friend in Gus Isidore that played with Seal. So Gus has worked with Pino a lot of times. So we'd just wind each other up, and I'd call Pino and go, you call that bass player? And he'd go, yeah, I floor you, But we never, we never actually met, And I have that relationship with a few bass players. I mean, Ralph Armstrong, who ended up playing with Aretha, but he was playing with Ma Vishnu Orchestra, right? Which is the way that I actually met John McLaughlin, right? Another funny story. Again, Ronnie Scott's Club in London, because that was my hangout. I was hanging out there. Like I said, they had the jazz downstairs and they had the reggae upstairs, so you couldn't really beat the place for hanging out, right? And so everybody kind of came through there. And I remember this night that I went in there and George Benson was performing in the jazz part of it. And George had another friend of ours named Peanut that was from Detroit that was playing with him. And Ralph Armstrong was just wandering around because, Ralph is a big guy, right? And I hadn't seen Ralph because I used to play. The reason I know Ralph Armstrong, his older brother had a doo-wop band called the Monte Carlos. Yeah. And I used to be the bass player for them, right? Like, when the Detroit Emeralds wasn't working, there was a club in Detroit called the High Chaparral, and I became the house bass player for them whenever I wasn't on tour with the Emeralds. Emeralds was my main thing. But when I was doing that, I was house bass player at the High Chaparral. This is where I was still young. I wasn't even 21 years old yet.
Oh, wow.
I was, I was just hitting with the heavy hitters because I got a musical ear. I don't read music, but if I hear something, I can play it almost immediately. That's how I could fit into all these different bands, Also because I have a wide variety of the music that I like. Talk about production. Let me just say that I have a couple of people that I'm producing. I've gone full circle with Detroit Emeralds, right? So right now, there's a song called There's No Distance. And There's No Distance was written by one of my greatest friends, a guy named Peter Sinfield, who wrote for King Crimson. He wrote for Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Mm-hmm. He wrote for Celine Dion. His biggest hits came off of Celine. He wrote Think Twice for Celine Dion. Massive records, right? So he wrote this song. I was hanging around with him all the time. He actually lived in Abbey Road, funny enough.
Wow.
He lived about 4 or 5 doors from Abbey Road Studios, right? So we was hanging around because he was writing songs, and he was a lovely guy, a beautiful person, Pete Sinfield, an amazing writer. So I used to hang around him all the time. And he was doing Celine's album. And then he had this song called There's No Distance that he had written the lyrics for. And he said that she turned it down. And I was listening to the song and I was looking at him and I said, Pete, this is like in the 80s, right? I said to Pete, look, man, that's one of the greatest songs I ever heard. So that's a big hit. But he had wrote so many hits that he didn't think it was any better than the other stuff he wrote. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, you got to realize while you're in this guy's apartment, there's literally gold and platinum albums everywhere. They're stacked up in the hallway. His bathroom got, all of these hits, because he wrote for so many people, big records, right? So he was going, well, I don't know about that song. Funny enough, and sadly enough, Pete Sinfield died literally about 3 weeks ago, or 4 weeks ago. But I hadn't seen him in years, but I told him at that time, I said, Pete, that song is a hit. One day I'm going to make a hit on it, right? And fortunately for me, more or less 2 years ago, I recorded and produced that record on the Detroit Emeralds, and it's still on the indie charts. So it's been on the indie charts for almost 2 years and still making money. So wow. I wrote Pete Sinfield a letter, said, told you. And he should be happy because it's making him money because I did all right out of it. So
there you go. So I looping back because I know where we kind of got a little lost. You were talking about your management company. Tell us fill us in on that last detail.
Right. So my business partner, his name is Kenneth Van Kenton. The name of the label is MCM Global Team. Okay. Right. And he manages, like I said, he manages a band called Blur. He manages Zenland. We both kind of, I don't produce them. They produce themselves. But the people I produce on it, we have an act called Stone and Jezreel, who are actually Nigerian twins, right? Girl and guy, but raised in Dublin, Ireland. But rapper and singer, unbelievable. So Stone, the rapper, is on 2 or 3 of the tracks that I'm doing. I got stuff getting ready to come out now, right? So Stone and Jezreel are signed to the same label. Detroit Emeralds are now signed to MCM as well, right? And I just did a couple of tracks on them. Like I said, that No Distance is still selling. But I also did a song that I wrote myself called Face to Face on them that's out. And I'm getting ready to put out another record on them now. I got to send it to them, right? Them, I have a girl named Mary O'Neill Nurberg, who's an incredible singer, really lovely, clear voice. So I got stuff coming out on her. I actually put out one track on her already called Bulletproof that she wrote herself. But I got an EP coming out on her literally just before Christmas, which is like next now.
Yeah.
Right. And then my own album. I've got I don't know if you ever heard the song called Everybody Knows. It was written by Leonard Cohen.
Rings a bell.
Yeah, it's a funny little song. Everybody knows the family's coming. Yeah. Everybody. But see, I changed it. Where if you heard the track now, you would think this is a man's world of James Brown. It's in 6/8 or 12/8, slow. And I changed the whole vibe of it, and then I added some extra chords to it, and it's incredible. I've got some amazing musicians playing on it. A guy named JP, he's like the #1 guitar player in Indonesia. He's like Slash in Indonesia.
Wow.
Right? So if it comes out in the street, women just follow him around and stuff, like this big rock star in Indonesia, right? And and his friend is a guy named Andy who actually worked for, well, up until recently he worked for Roland. He's a keyboard player, amazing. And I heard he just switched over to Nord keyboards,
Okay.
which is great. That means I'll be able to get them cheap. And but he's playing on this track. Everybody knows that's going to be pretty much my first single. The Alta Montreux track is actually the first track that I'm releasing as Jerome Rimson, and then this Everybody Knows will be out pretty much the same time. So they're ready to go now.
Very cool. Well,
Yeah.
and Jerome, with your whole lifetime of all of this experience and all these great stories, I feel like we've just barely scratched the surface. But I really do hope that this piques people's curiosity and they check out your website when it's up and they check out your management company. And we really appreciate you taking time to share this window into your long and illustrious lifetime as a musician. I mean, oh my gosh, over 55 years, folks. You've seen him here on Bass Musician Magazine, Jerome Rimson.
Thank you very much, mate, and I hope to see you soon. I'll send you some links to some great stuff.
Excellent. Right? Thank you, man. Take care.
All right. Thank you, brother. Take care. See you.